how did I come to this work? I would like to think that I was born into the work. As early as I can remember, I have lived in very harmful places. I grew up in Jamaica during the 1970s, and it was a time of immense political instability. I remember going outside as a kid and seeing people with machine guns, tear gas everywhere, bodies. Um, I remember my mom hiding me in closets during just really politically violent times. So I feel I was born into a very violent world. Um, we eventually migrated to New York in 1986, and it was the American dream, right? We were all seeking the American dream. Ultimately, I ended up, the word I used to use for a long time is dropping out, but I'd like to correct that and say I was eventually pushed out of school, meaning that I never had a connection with the educational system. It felt very disconnected, and ultimately I stopped attending. And there was immense consequences to that, and one of them being that I ultimately had a lot of time on my hands. And my great-grandmother always used to say, idle time is the devil's playground. And I would ultimately get into trouble. And a long story that is currently being written, but it would end up with me at 18 years old being on Rikers Island, facing life in prison. And my first offer was actually 25 years to life. And I remember asking the attorney, are you sure you're looking at the right charges, as I hadn't killed anyone? And he said to me that possessing drugs, which at the time was an A1 felony for as little as 2 to 4 ounces of cocaine, was the equivalent of murder. And I had been charged with 8 A1 felonies, which was the equivalent of 8 murders. And was actually telling me that if I got 25 years to life, that it would be a good thing. And I was shocked at what was happening to me. I was shocked at the lack of humanity that the system presented. I was shocked that no one stopped and asked, why is an 18-year-old in this position? And that to me was, as harmful as the sentence that I would receive after spending 6 months on Rikers Island. At 18 years old, I was given no bail. I ultimately was sentenced to 7 years to life, and judge told me that he was doing me a favor by only sentencing me to 7 years to life at 19 years old. I ultimately would go upstate, which is where most people who are incarcerated from New York City end up, and be miles, hundreds of miles away from my family. And ultimately, fast forward 5 years into that experience, I would end up in a college program. And it was, by all accounts, a blessing beyond any blessings I could receive. Because in 1995, the crime bill discontinued college and prisons, and this was significant as college was one of the few things that had empirical validity in reducing recidivism. But yet the narrative that was put out that we were creating smarter criminals, and as a result, college and prisons got discontinued. And this was around the same time as my incarceration. I was incarcerated in 1994. So 5 years later, to have access to college was a life-changing opportunity for me, and very, in many ways, prepping me for the work that I'd ultimately do. And in this program, one of the things that was tremendously amazing for me was the sense of community. To be in a prison, right, where you feel your humanity is challenged in every way, and to ultimately find a safe space, to find a community where you could dream, where you could actually imagine yourself outside of, probably the darkest place you'd ever been in your life, was, by all accounts, the greatest gift I could have. I would ultimately receive an associate's degree there and be released maybe a year after that. And once I was released, I was dedicated to dismantling the system. I knew that prison was a very dehumanizing institution, and I knew that this wasn't how we should handle what Angela Davis has often said, our social ills. And I also knew the humanity there, right? Like it wasn't just theoretical for me anymore. Some of the most amazing people I'd ever met in my life were in those spaces. Some of the people that offered me the greatest amount of humanity were in those spaces. Some of the people that made sure that I read the books I needed to read, that I was thinking the way that I should think, were in those spaces. So I felt very much responsible to do this work, to do the work of not only reducing harm for people who are incarcerated in those spaces, which I feel is reform, because the system is doing exactly what it's intended to do. A mentor of mine once said, Eddie Ellis, that if any other business had as many returns as a prison system, they would go out of business. Yet this business continues to thrive. So I had no doubt that my goal and my purpose was to dismantle this system. And I knew I needed to understand more. And the more that I began to understand, I really understood just what it was. I understood how pervasive it was. I understood that it was a system that connected very much to slavery. I understood that 1 in 3 men that looked like me were in that system. I understood that in the 1990s when the hip-hop of my generation, we were all talking about that. You know, like Wu-Tang's 40 of us in the back of a bus. Life is a shorty, shouldn't be so rough. You know, but as the world turned, I learned life is hell. Because living in a world no different than a cell, right? That wasn't just my experience. That was the experience of my generation. So much of this work it's deeply personal, not only because it's impacted me, yet I understand that it's also very much rooted in the history of oppression. So beginning to look at prisons not as, the problem, but see prisons as a symptom of the problem, and really beginning to push our conversations around humanity and dignity for people in prisons, but also our need to really rethink this entire institution.